And so we're back now with our second of three videos. I'm going to do common vector formats here, and I'm going to save the geodatabase discussion for the last video, one of the vector formats or one data format that we use regularly in GIS. But we're going to start here with shapefiles. Shapefiles are familiar to you already. In some of your exercises, you've already used them. Assignment number 2, you've created one. Shapefile is the native format to the original ArcView, so the Windows-friendly version that was developed in the 90s. They developed this new file format called the shapefile. And as the second bullet indicates there, it's one of the standard data formats for GIS data, so you might get some GIS data from an organization, download it from the web. You might get it on DVD or CD, and chances are there's a good chance that it's going to be in the form of shapefiles, so all your layers are going to come down as shapefiles. But this third point is really important. Be careful, because several individual files make up a single shapefile, a single layer, and so the way we see it in our catalog, just like our raster files, is going to be different than the way we see it in Microsoft Windows Explorer. So we're going to come back to this shapefiles extensions defined link that I've embedded in the slides in just a minute, but I'm going to hop out of here, come back into our catalog like we did before. I'm going to come into the shape folder, and so we see several shape files here. We've got line shape files, we've got points, and we've got polygons and several other types as well. So we have a total of 10 layers here that we're going to sort of preview. So I'm going to do building line, and that's going to show us, I'm just going to zoom to the extents here, show you the full extents of the data. I'm going to zoom into the Essex campus here. And so those are our building outlines as represented by lines. We can also show them by polygons with a fill, and then we can also show them by their point centroid locations. We can also show contours, which are going to give us elevation. So these are lines of consistent elevation across campus. Of course, hydro line is going to be our streams, and then small ponds. We don't have any lakes over here near CCBC Essex, so we have small ponds that have been digitized at the county level. Properties, I'm going to back out just a little bit here so we can kind of see that. We can see the multiple parcels that have been purchased over the years that make up the property information for CCBC Essex. So the owner name there listed as the Board of Trustees. Road lines, so this is basically the edge of pavement. I'm kind of using the basic navigation tools that you see in ArcMap. They give you here an Arc catalog so that you can sort of peruse your data before you decide to load it into a map project. So these are lines representing the edge of pavement, and then there are polygons representing the edge of pavement. And then when you click on wooded, those are going to be, as interpreted from aerial photography, areas that are wooded around our campus, some of which are actually on our campus. So each one of these is an individual shapefile, an individual layer that we could potentially put into our ArcMap projects. So what does that look like in Windows Explorer? This is one of the more important ones that we're going to discuss. So I'm going to actually pull up that folder. And remember, we had 10 layers in that folder, but if we look at it through this same location in Windows Explorer, we see that we have way many more files that sort of exist in the background that make up each one of those individual files. So here we have building line, we've got a DBF, a PRJ file, we have a shape file, we have this lock file, and that lock file really exists temporarily because I also have the same file open in our catalog, so it's locking the file out so I don't make any changes to it while another piece of software is reading it. There's no file extension here that says XML, but you can see the type of file that it is. It's an XML document that accompanies the building shapefile, the building line shapefile that stores information about that layer, and then the SHX file, that is an index file that holds information, index information. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the point that I want to make here with this is that these multiple individual files contribute to what we see here in our catalog. So that's important to remember if you're moving your data around in Windows Explorer versus our catalog, that you make sure you grab every file associated with it. If in our catalog you were to make a copy of this and paste it into a different folder, it would know to grab all of those files and take them all with that particular layer. So that's an important note, if you will, to make about shape files. Come back into the slides here, and I want to go out to the Resource Center. This is a link that I've embedded in the slides. You guys can go out there and take a look. The help is wonderful. for ArcGIS. You can just search on a topic. In this case, I'm just going to type in shapefiles. And desktop 10 is where we are now. The software is actually up to 10.1, but we're working towards getting to that point. But right now we're operating at desktop 10. So when we click on what is a shapefile, it's going to give us some basic information similar to what I just gave you in my screenshots. But if you come over here to file extensions, it actually gives you a definition for all of those different file extensions and then some. There are some in here that I've actually never even come across myself, but the ones that we're really most concerned with, obviously the .shp file stores the geometry. The .dbf file, as the name database file or dbase table would indicate, that's where our attributes are stored. One of the other ones that can be that is very important as well is the PRJ file, and again, as the extension name indicates, this is where our coordinate system and projection information is stored. Some of these other files are actually auto-generated by the software themselves, and you can see that several of them are different types of spatial indices. So just like the index in a book, you find a topic in the back, and it's going to tell you which page or pages to go to. Indices are going to a spatial index or an attribute index. It's going to make those layers queryable, and they're going to query a lot faster. And we'll talk about queries in a future module. So definitely make use of this resource center. You guys can take a look yourself and look at all the different topics. And again, you can just search very easily. If you're having a particular problem in the software, you can go ahead and use the resource center to help you out. Again, just a screenshot here of the shapefiles. This is just of the same data that we looked at in ArchiCatalog. Points represented by points, lines represented by this particular little icon here, and then polygons with the areas actually drawn in. And they have this characteristic sort of greenish color, whereas rasters all had that same pixel icon. Each one of our vector formats is going to have its own sort of color and style to its icons. Let's talk about coverage. We talked about grid for raster formats. So this is coverage, which is the native vector format to ArcInfo. And just like we stored raster grids as a set of folders on disk, so is the coverage format. So there's a lot of data out there still in the format, but you don't wind up using coverages a whole lot. A lot of times what they do is convert it to shapefile or to another format like GeoDatabase, which we'll be talking about here to wrap up the lecture and the demo. So you can see in the screenshot here what we're going to be looking at in ArchiCatalog in just a second. So again, I'm going to jump out of here, jump into coverage. And you see I've got 5 different coverages here, which are basically different layers that I can use. These happen to be from an analysis that we did to estimate populations at risk of flooding for the Maryland Emergency Management Agency several years ago. And so what we're looking at here is this ALLE_BG is Allegheny County block groups. And so those block groups contain census data information, population counts for total population, excuse me, and Hispanic population, non-English speaking population, and then age 65 and up, an elderly population that might be more difficult to move in the event of an emergency. So as I go back here and look at these different coverages, that's how many people, according to the census. The Allegheny residential areas show us where the actual people live, and then of course we go into the Q3 layer, which if I preview that, Q3 data is floodplain data. So we were basically looking to see where the floodplains came through. We were taking the people, the number of people, the counts, and placing them where they actually lived, and if they intersected one of these floodplains, then we would make calculations to see how many people were at risk. So when I click on that, you can see that I'm in a particular zone. I'm in AE, which means A means that I'm in a 100-year floodplain, and then E means that base flood elevations were determined by engineers. So very useful data for mapping where floodplains are relative to our homes, but in this case we used it to map where populations at risk of flooding were located around the state of Maryland. And as I mentioned with shapefiles, coverages have their own distinct look. They're going to have this sort of yellowish kind of tinge to them with the white icon on top. If it's points or if it's lines, it's going to have a different icon here than the polygons that we see here as an example for coverage. But again, if we go back out to Windows Explorer and we go into the coverage folder, this is what it looks like on disk. So we've got the different layers, the 5 different layers, and of course the accompanying info folder. So again, being mindful not to go in and muck around with all these different files, please. Again, I don't want you guys corrupting your data. I don't want you going in and corrupting any of these info folders or info files. So a lot of times if you're dealing with coverages, you just kind of leave them alone in the Windows Explorer environment and deal with them here in our catalog. Again, if we were to move this file to another location, it would know to take a copy of the info folder with it. So let me come back in here to my coverages. And still yet one more, and I'm going to wrap it up here with common vector formats, at least for these 3 major ones. DWG, as I mentioned at some point in an earlier lecture, there's a two-way street between GIS and CAD. So CAD folks that know GIS or GIS folks that know CAD are very valuable to their organizations, and of course CAD drawings can find their way into a GIS and can be very useful in a GIS environment. So if I were to look at this, the example that I have to give of you guys is of the 2nd floor of the building that I'm located in here at the Essex campus. So if I preview that, I'm going to see it in its sort of constituent parts. Any annotation layers, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you guys can see that a little bit better. You can actually see the room numbers themselves for the different parts of the CAD drawing. Any point objects that are listed on there, multi-patches are different area polygons that are also on the drawing, and then we've got different other types of polygons that again might have been drawn in by the CAD operator, and then polyline is actually going to be the building floor plan itself. So in this case we're looking at a couple of different labs and classrooms, a couple of offices, bathroom. That happens to be my office right there. Really good example of how CAD data can find its way into GIS. And of course that's the way that our catalog perceives it on disk. Now if I were to take this entire DWG file, this drawing file, and drag it into ArcMap or add it into ArcMap, it would actually show the total of all of these constituent parts together at the same time, and you have the choice to turn them off as you wish. So where we're going to wrap up here in the 3rd video is going to be the discussion of geodatabases and of topology. So as you can see, I've got a couple of different canisters or geodatabases that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to come back to the slides here to wrap up. And so we talked about DWG, the CAD world and the GIS world sort of working together, coverages, which are an older format native to ArcInfo, and then of course shapefiles. So we're going to wrap it up here, and we're going to get into the 3rd video with geodatabases, and then we're going to wrap it up with a discussion on topology.